Three Thick Bricks.
Hello everyone, welcome to Three Thick Bricks, a monthly podcast which explores the musical world of Jethro Tull, album by album. I'm your host Robin, and I'm joined this week in the Wimpy Bar, I'm the one eating the 25p Knickerbocker Glory, by Brent and Adrian. How are we, gents?
We're dandy, thank you.
Excellent. Dandy.
Sorry, I'm dandy.
Bar.
I haven't. I shouldn't speak for you, Adrian.
How are you, Adrian?
Very good. I just suddenly realised I'd left my notes at the other end of the house, so I just sprinted off.
You have notes. What is this?
Oh yeah, it's all in here.
It's just like homework.
This is like a real podcast.
I just got told I could turn up and talk crap and drink wine.
Yeah, I just realised I'm still sober. Sorry.
No, I've got that well in hand. So. No, I do have to ask, Robin, because
Yes.
I've already. You two have a heritage that I don't share.
Right.
I have no idea what you were talking. What Knickerbockers?
You never been to a Wimpy Bar?
Yeah, Wimpy
No, I
Bars,
haven't.
yeah. So, yeah, Wimpy
I
Bars
thought
were...
that was Windy Bar. I know it's a wind. No, I don't think that now. But I thought he was saying Windy Bar, which I thought was very exotic.
Well, a Wimpy Bar these
but
days is pretty
Wimpy
much
Bar.
as exotic, because I have
Yeah.
not seen one for...
They don't exist. They don't
Decades,
exist
yes.
here in Australia.
No.
So.
If you Google Wimpy Bar 1970s menu, you can see the glorious food that you could order
Alleged
around the
food.
time. That probably, Jethro Tull would have gone and eaten, I guess.
Yeah, after a
was it
big gig.
That's right.
Was it a burger bar?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought Wimpy Burgers.
Yeah.
So what's a 50p Knickerbocker?
Knickerbocker Glory is like a sundae, like a sort of chocolate ice cream sundae. It's 25 pence, 25p. There you go.
The banana split was also, another of their big items. I don't recall ever actually having a burger from there. I think it was mainly just the ice cream desserts we went for as kids.
Yeah, that's right. And apparently they were like the first fast food hamburger chain in Africa, in South Africa, and places like that as well. So they were kind of truly global, right? So there you go.
And Jethro Tull definitely would have, gone there
Eaten in a Wimpy Bar.
after every gig. Because they did lots of gigs
Or
apparently.
left
so-
left women in Wimpy Bar.
After going to the cinema, yes.
So maybe we should enlighten the listener a little bit about what we're going to be doing and why we're going to be. I'm sure they're very interested in Wimpy Bars, but what we're going to be doing and why we're doing this.
I think why is the main question.
This series
Well,
of podcasts
that was my second question.
between now and 2050 when we get to the final album.
So I'm Brent. I'm a aging rocker, middle-aging rocker. I guess all three of us are.
Yes.
And
yes.
I think, well, Robin, you might be able to tell us what the inspiration for doing the podcast was. It was your brainchild, your baby. But I think we have a shared love of Jethro Tull, which we've had for many, many years since we were teenagers together. And we're now not teenagers by several decades anymore. But among many other things, I think Tull has been one of the foundations of our friendship over all these years. And that's probably the most... the soppiest thing I'm going to say for the rest of these
You are
podcasts.
drunk. I knew it.
Well, and to me, it's the very important 53rd and a half anniversary of Jethro Tull's beginning, and that we can't really allow that milestone to go past unremarked, I don't think.
All right. It's a third milestone.
Yes, I'm Adrian. I'm the youngest of the crowd, so I'll be speaking for the youth of today and all the tweens who are no doubt listening in and wondering what's going on. I'll bring that fresh relevance to the conversation.
So I'm the senior citizen.
Yeah,
I'm the senior
I guess
citizen.
so, yeah.
Right. Okay. Maybe we could discuss how we discovered Tull.
That's a good idea. Who wants to open that archive and kick that off?
My discovery of Tull was easy,
Yes.
Robin, because that was you.
Yes.
You introduced me to
To
Tull.
blame.
Yes,
Yes, so So my musical taste, as you probably know, is when I was younger was not not angled towards music like Jethro Tull. In fact, Jethro Tull was my dirty little secret. Wouldn't have admitted to anyone that I was interested in a bearded hippie band. I was very much into punk and post-punk and, The Cure's, Susie and the Banshees, Pill. And you probably, as we remember in the 1980s, the Sydney pub music scene was very vibrant.
Very.
Threatening to my education and career because I'd spend 2 or 3 nights a week out watching some of the best live music I've ever seen.
That's the biggest thing compared to today, isn't it? I mean, I think when Jethro Tull started in the 60s, the club scene was just huge. And again, as we were growing up even, as a student at university or whatever, if you weren't going out to a couple of gigs a week, then what were you really doing at university? Nothing.
Exactly.
That's a good question. Well, I asked myself that a few times.
Exactly. And just talking to the tweens, Adrian, there was no internets, no YouTubes, none of that. You had to make your own fun in those days. So,
But the Sydney music scene then, maybe it's just nostalgia, but I think everyone recognises that in the 80s the Sydney live music scene was something special, and it was all garage music and heavy guitar-based stuff. No hippies. No bearded
hobos,
folky musicians. It was not the sort of music. Tull was not the sort of music I was generally listening to, but I think it says something about the quality and the
diversity,
the quality of the music that it just struck me and has remained a favourite ever since. And I'm now old enough and no, not wise enough. I'm old enough now that I can and have a broader enough music taste that I can safely admit in public that I'm a big Tull fan.
Yeah.
Yeah, and for me, it was like the 1980s as well. And it was like the whole New Romantics, Ultravox and Vienna and Adam and the Ants. And I think it was when I first heard them and that, a lot of their stuff went, don't really like that. But a lot of their stuff went, oh, that's pretty good. And I guess it was a bit of a bridge almost between the songs, the music we'd heard growing up as kids from our parents and this sort of new wave 80s music.
Yeah, that's that's kind of interesting. It's interesting you say that, Adrian, but also Brent, because I had very narrow musical tastes in about 1985, 86. I have much more diverse musical tastes these days, but back then I was heavy metal and progressive metal were sort of my sort of almost exclusive, AC/DC, Black Sabbath, and Rush. Yeah,
I was going to say one band. There was one above all, and I remember the Denim Vest, Robin.
The band that nobody else ever wanted to talk.
I'm not criticising your fashion sense because, as we well know, the fashion atrocities I committed were.
Yes, I remember sewing little Rush stars on the back of denim jackets and all kinds of things. So,
is that what those were?
Yeah, that's what they were.
So I assumed, and many people do, when you mention people who are uninitiated, and you mention Jethro Tull, they assume heavy metal.
Yeah.
Now we're not. I assume we're going to talk about the greatest heavy metal band of 1987.
Oh, we went there with that early, didn't we?
Sometime later.
Yes.
So the fatwa has already started. Am I allowed to say that? Sorry, that probably wasn't. But I've already broken the podcast.
Exactly.
Sorry.
So, that controversy. Yes.
But people do assume. I do they get it mixed up with Judas Priest?
Yeah.
But I would have, knowing your musical tastes, and when you trotted out Jethro Tull, and I cannot. I've got a suspicion I remember which album it was, but I can't remember completely. But exactly. But I assumed heavy metal.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure it was Heavy Horses.
Right.
And that was not. heavy metal.
Yeah, because I had this friend Nathan who so I was into Rush big time and sort of progressive rock as it was called, particularly that. And he said, "Oh, there's this band called Jethro Tull," and he sort of tried to sort of this is the pheromones. Remember Nathan and his pheromones? This is the
well, so yes. Did I tell the pheromone story? Nathan, I've forgotten his name, but I do remember the occasion. And so he's the source.
He is the source because
he's the Jethro Tull Big Bang.
He is. The pheromones didn't work, but certainly the cassettes he let me do.
Our Tull guru. Well, it wasn't. Yeah, we were going to a party.
Yes, that's right.
Remember, and we went over. Yep. You were probably wearing your denim jacket.
Yes, I was probably. Yeah,
I'm sure you were. You remember, and we went over to his place, and it might have been the first time I met him. And we listened to some Tull then, and I can't remember whether I was under the influence of something, but I'm pretty sure that I was blown away when I heard it, and I'm pretty sure it was Stormwatch.
Yes,
put on.
yes.
I'm guessing, but I've got a memory for that. Yep. But he actually invited us. He said, "Come on, I've got something down in the garage before we go out to the party for you." And I thought, all right, we're going to score. This is great. Thanks. And we went down and he pulled out this bottle of clear stuff. And I thought, what the hell? What's that? And it said, it's pheromones for pulling the women. And so we both got dabs of pheromones on the back of our neck
just a very small amount. It was very powerful.
We didn't want to use very powerful stuff.
Now I have a question for all the women out there. Did it work?
Well, I do have to say no.
It did.
So no, it did. I'm pretty confident we didn't have any success with the women that night.
And it is interesting you talked about Stormwatch because the two cassettes he lent me were Stormwatch and Living in the Past. And it was particularly Living in the Past that really, which I'm sure we will talk about in more detail at some stage.
So I think my entry to Tull was through, I think of Tull in phases, and maybe we'll talk about this later, but those later 70s albums where Elizabethan Boogie it's called, isn't it? But it wasn't really, it stopped being Elizabethan and was more sort of bucolic and then sort of, those sorts of themes. But I thought about them, and they were probably Heavy Horses, Stormwatch, Broadsword maybe were the first three albums that I heard, but ultimately they weren't my favourite period of Tull music, and we can talk about those. I mean, those three albums I still love, but became very much interested in maybe their earlier music, which we'll be discussing very soon. So.
Yeah, I think that those, like you say, Stormwatch and Broadsword are probably the ones we heard early on, and I was quite surprised when, sort of later on looking through, lists of their best albums, Stormwatch and Broadsword did not make it into the top few, but I guess it's just that nostalgia and, when they were the ones I knew originally, that kind of you get biased towards those, so... Yeah, I never tried to use pheromones to impress the girls, but I did think that my edgy Tull cheerleading would, because, they certainly weren't mainstream. They were unknown. They were unknown and dangerous, and that's bound to impress the girls, I thought. I'm not sure that actually worked. I think it did actually impress their parents a fair bit. The fathers in particular had albums of Jethro Tulls, and I think they were quite impressed. But I'm not sure that really helped in the long run.
I did. I've said I was a bit inhibited about admitting to my Tull, love of Tull, and I think I might have had... I'm pretty sure the song was Moths from Heavy Horses on. And my dad came in and said, "Oh, I quite like that." And I thought,
oh no, the standard doom. Yeah, it's like my mum coming in and going, "Oh, this new order's all right, actually."
Well, that's why I knew we were onto a winner with Adam and the Ants, because Dad said, "This is a load of rubbish. You won't even know who they are in 5 years." Well, Dad, it's 35 years later and I still know who they are.
So, Ant music. I don't want to digress too much, but I didn't know you were a...
Well, we all were, weren't we?
What were the fans of... I wasn't. What were the fans of ant music called? Of Adam and the Ants?
Antelopes?
Were they the ant army?
Oh, the ant army, yes, could be.
Were you a soldier of the ant army?
Oh, yeah, so much.
Yeah. That was the first album I ever bought, was Kings of the Wild Frontier.
Oh, yes, King of the Wild Frontier.
Yep.
Before any Rush album, you're willing to admit that? In public.
Yes, I am willing to admit that was the first album I ever bought, but very quickly from that, I moved on to Black Sabbath. So quite a...
I think my first album, actually my first gig was an ELO gig.
Oh, okay. Progressive.
I think my first album was this was in the 70s, and so my mate and I, I can't have been that old. I was 10, 11 years old, and very unlike my parents, they dropped us off at the Sydney Cricket Ground.
Wow.
And we went in alone, and we were sitting amongst, you can imagine, mid-70s. We were sitting in the middle of a bunch of hippies.
Would have been fragrant.
It was fragrant. I swear we got stoned. passive stoning at the age of 10 or 11. Great show. I remember the lasers. But I turned 12 and I heard the Sex Pistols and the Clash, and ELO never hit the turntable ever again.
Yes, after that, yes.
What was the name of that ELO album? It was the one with Telephone Line on it. Anyway, that was my first album. I'd love to lie and say that my first album was Brick or something.
Well, I've never actually bought an album because I'm too cheap, so I just borrow music from everyone else and listen to it. YouTube is great. Kids, we all know this.
You borrowed?
You don't buy... I probably want a Rush album from Robin, if not the Jethro Tull ones, because when you're travelling to uni an hour and a half or 2 hours on the bus every day, you've got your Walkman with you. You got to have cassettes of all the big hitters: Jethro Tull, Billy Joel. Let's move on.
Oh, you're a rebel.
So one of the things for me about doing this podcast is I read a thing about War and Peace, which is
Is this more hard work?
Very enjoyable to read. And they said one of the great things about War and Peace is there's so much of it. It's that's why it makes an awesome podcast, because there's so many albums and it's so varied. If Jethro Tull had brought out 3 albums and that was it, it's the fact their longevity makes for a really, not only just the diversity of music, but just how they changed over time. It's really fascinating and makes for a really interesting...
Yeah, I don't know if there's something for everyone, but there's certainly a lot of things for a lot of different people.
Absolutely. Yeah, there is. And that for me is why going through album by albums, literally stepping through every album. I mean, it's just an excuse to revisit the albums if nothing else.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I've been doing a bit of listening lately, and it is like wearing it's like putting on an old warm blanket.
Yeah.
A lice-ridden, filthy one for some of the albums.
Speaking of lice-ridden, filthy blankets, actually, that just reminded me. You were talking before about your musical taste, Brent, and I remember being at your house and you were playing. You were playing Lloyd Cole and the Commotions, the Rattlesnakes album.
My friends probably far too well.
And I really liked Lloyd Cole a lot, but I remember you playing that album quite a bit. But the thing that I do remember was, I think you had it on CD, because you had a CD player relatively early, I think. Am I remembering that right?
Yeah. Early adopter.
Yes. And so you kept playing it, but your mum and dad must have been listening to Demis Roussos, and they'd left the sort of album cover or the CD cover nearby, and I just assumed without looking at the cover too much that was Lloyd Cole, this sort of hairy, obese-looking Greek guy. That's what I thought Lloyd Cole was.
A caftan, Lloyd Cole in a caftan. He'd be mortified.
Yeah, and there's a few things I think that I liked about Jethro Tull. I mean, just like anything I can sing, because I'll sing anything, anytime, as you might remember. But so I liked that all their songs weren't just love songs, because you get bloody love songs there on every street corner kind of thing. So that was good. But one thing I think which is overlooked with is that Ian Anderson, he's not Freddie Mercury. He's a baritone. So for those of you who don't know vocal ranges, there's tenors, which is high, squeaky voices, basses, which is very deep voices, but 90% of us are just bog standard, boring baritones. And when you've got a baritone as your lead singer, it makes it so much easier to just sing along to, belt along to it. And the lyrics are just, so clever and different and strange and involving that, you just can't help but be sucked in with some of the turns of phrase.
Yeah.
He was a good lyricist.
Yep.
I mean, that's one of the attractions. We probably all have an interest in reading and literature and good turn of phrase. And I'm not going to call him a poet, but certainly it was a little bit more engaging than "God Save the Queen."
Yeah.
There's another dirty secret I'm going to have to air here.
Get off your chest.
We said we would. Well, I'm going to expose all of you. So, that probably one of the reasons that Tull attracted us, another basis for our friendship, was that we were into tabletop gaming around this time, and particularly role-playing gaming.
Yes.
And we were fairly busy doing that. Particularly games like Call of Cthulhu, which and just playing Dungeons and Dragons, but that sort of thing. And we got very heavily involved in the very active and vital and quite stimulating Sydney convention scene.
Yep.
But I think Tull, particularly those albums that we first listened to, we were talking about the sort of Elizabethan boogie albums, and those sort of themes that they had resonated with that interest, I think.
Yes.
Atmospheric, intelligent music
Yep.
was a great companion to that hobby. And I think that actually...
Well, large bearded men have always been pretty synonymous with role-playing. So, the Jethro Tull album covers fitted right in with that.
We weren't large and bearded.
No, we were the supermodels of the role-playing set. Hands up, everyone who found your girlfriend / wife.
Wife there.
Let's not go there.
Okay. Robin didn't. Robin?
No, I broke free, and
These are mundane. Let's face it.
But I'm going to also say that so this is really interesting. My current wife is a Tull lover, and she doesn't like a lot of it, but she has very fond memories of Heavy Horses, Stormwatch. She loves them, so that was something in common. But I had a couple of girlfriends who loved Tull, and again, I was not hanging out or listening to that sort of music, and it was just interesting that for a lot of people, it sort of crossed musical. Genres for them.
My wife is very musical as well, but very different to us, and like she runs choirs and things like that. She really loves some of their music.
Yes, she does.
Definitely not all to any extent, whatever. But a song like "Slow Marching Band," for instance, she actually loves that. For example, it's also one of my favorite songs because it's just more sort of lyrical, I guess, and Songs from the Wood has those harmonies in. So there's a lot of things to attract musicians as well. Apparently, some of the chord progressions and things like on Aqualung are just like I've seen like an hour podcast type of thing, just discussing and breaking down chord progressions on one song on Aqualung, and then it's just like goes over my head completely. But apparently, they're mind blowing.
This is probably a good time to point out that this podcast will not enlighten anyone around about musical theory. Or that is not
if you
very
want
much.
There's other podcasts out there that will enlighten you completely.
We're very much amateur
enthusiasts.
Enthusiasts. Although we do, and I apologies in advance, we do dabble in music.
In fact, the listeners will already have heard and possibly already stopped listening after our intro, which we put together.
There may be more.
more listeners or more.
They're suggesting they're mutually exclusive.
I did want to take up that point about sort of for girlfriends and partners being, Jethro Tull being a sort of a glue that, a common sort of glue that binding people together. I kind of found the opposite. I found the more I walked away from Jethro Tull and Rush, the more successful I became attracting.
I wouldn't say my success was because of Jethro Tull, to be honest. I'm just saying that despite me liking it, there were some songs that, my partner would like as well.
Yeah, but, I found, ABC or Scritti Politti or Human League. I just,
Human League.
Not that I want to gender those sorts of bands or anything. I'm just, but I think you're right though. I think because Jethro Tull has such a breadth and depth of, there's something for everybody there, and I think there is something that everybody can like about them without them being. I think one of the dangers with sort of progressive rock is it can end up in a sort of adult middle of the road kind of space, and I don't think I think Jethro Tull definitely avoided that kind of MOR radio FM friendly kind of space, which they could have ended up in, I suppose. I don't think they did. So
that's interesting. As I've said, my musical tastes have broadened, and I am listening to. So I think what I've, as I've gotten older, what I've realised is that everybody was young once. And
that is very deep.
That's why you invited me to the podcast.
For the philosophical musings.
That's great. So for the revelations. But I think what I mean is that when I was 18 years old, any music that wasn't sort of dark and dirty and grungy didn't exist then, but was sort of not heavy guitar based and fairly simple. Was just not worth listening to, except for Tull. But I've gotten more of an appreciation of realising that when you look back at bands when they were starting out, they were fresh and raw and young, and Tull were. Yeah. And you can see and hear that energy and the youth vibe around them.
Absolutely.
That's the thing to me about Jethro Tull is, and they so clearly were not marketed or, buffed around the edges to the extent like the Rolling Stones or Pink Floyd or the Beatles were. They looked like they were just, random hobos that have been pulled together before the show to you get up on stage and you play that bloody instrument.
I do think Ian Anderson cultivated that.
He did.
Because even like on This Was, they must have been young there. They must be in their 20s, but they've kind of got this, we're 50 years old and they live on the streets look, I don't know if this is true or whether he's sort of recreating history. I don't know, but
he says in an interview I've seen, and this is a interview from the past 10 years, so it's recent. Past 10 years is recent, but he said that they were invited to Woodstock.
Yeah, they're actually on the Woodstock. You can hear them playing over the. You can hear them playing over it, but whether they actually.
So he didn't say they went. No, he said he intentionally turned it down.
Yeah, right.
Because he saw Woodstock as a particular type of festival.
Yep.
And for a particular type of band, and he was looking forward, and he didn't think that's where Tull should have been. So, I mean, there are other bands, famously the Stones didn't play there. I don't think they were invited, were they? But there were, a lot of bands that was a defining moment for them. Jimi Hendrix was always big, but Woodstock was a defining moment for Hendrix. And you'd have to think that any band would have retrospectively killed to have been there. He says he made an intentional decision because he didn't think that was the direction for Tull. And they chose to go to the Isle of Wight instead, and we may discuss that at some time.
Yeah, I think that would be really interesting.
Got that concept on DVD.
Wow.
And even just the name itself, Jethro Tull, I mean, it doesn't exactly scream workshopped by a committee of people who knows how to get bands ahead. I mean, just conjures up kind of old-fashioned, musty Victorian, and I guess, he was an 18th century agriculturalist apparently. But they actually decided this was a good name. I guess it made them stand apart from, whatever other band names were going around at the time.
It's kind of hipsterish because that's sort of where the hipster movement, which I think is kind of overdone now, but the hipster movement of the last 10 years, with the big beards and the sort of, that kind of retro kind of look. It's a similar kind of, it's a similar kind of thing. There's that famous, famous Simpsons episode where the hipsters take over Springfield, and Homer's like, he's got all this infant formula he's been hoarding in the back of his garden that sets alight, and the hipster fire brigade comes along, but they've only got the oldie worldy hand pump to sort of put it out, and they can't because they're all hipsters in the 18th century fire gear. So that idea of that kind of, it's almost like hipsters before they were hipsters in that way, that sort of oldie worldy style.
Yeah, and I think that sort of cultural style of thing is a lot bigger in England than it would be here, just because of the, there's still people living that lifestyle.
Tull is a quintessentially English band. They are English, but so were, I guess so were Led Zeppelin, but I don't. There's something very English about Tull, and. That would probably resonate with both of you, but Australia is maybe not so much now, but was very much is a Commonwealth country and was very much focused on Britain.
Yep.
And I think maybe that just resonated a bit more with me and with us in Australia, although growing up in the northern beaches of Sydney was not exactly like the English countryside in any way, shape or form. It's so sort of heightened beach culture and very different. But it just, I don't know, that just resonated. And some of the Tull albums, maybe even intentionally, are very, very British in there.
As you said, they're very bucolic type of feel.
But not just that, I just even in the urban sense, that particularly in some of the earlier albums and songs, the references to British places and Leicester Square, etc., and just the Jamsanis and it just feels.
Oh yes, Blackpool. Yeah, that's
Blackpool. It just feels English.
Yeah,
and I think Ian Anderson particularly was very, very, and maybe we'll discuss that for the next album, but maybe that sense of Britishness and folk roots are because blues is the basis of rock and roll, there's no question about it, but it's an American based music, and it's spread far and wide and become influenced many styles of music, particularly rock coming out of the 60s and the 70s and to now. But I wonder if that's why he made a conscious decision to move away from that.
Because otherwise it just would have been another Rolling Stones or another Cream or something like that.
Yeah. Which is not been a terrible thing to be.
But this is the impression I get, is that back when they were trying to make it big in inverted commas, there were just so many bands playing so many gigs, and they changed their name like literally every week, because you'd play at the place and you'd say at the end, "Do you want us back?" And they'd go, you were good, but you weren't that good, and we know that we can just get the next band in and pay them half of what we'd have to pay you for a return gig. So no. So they'd say, "All right, we'll ring you up in 2 days' time, and now we're the John Evans Smash, not the Smash of John Evans." And we won a gig, and it wasn't until I think one of the clubs gave them had them on retainer, that they sort of started to really build that profile and become who they were.
Have anyone done their homework? What sort of clubs did Tull start playing at?
It was the Marquee Club in London.
Ah, the Marquee Club, right.
And I think it was John G. Yeah, John G. Yeah, there's the song One for John G.
Yeah,
He was the manager there who gave them a break and put them on a retainer, had them coming back. And that's how they started to build their profile and whatever.
Right. I did hear an interview with him recently where he said it was a very anxious time in those early days because there was no plan B. No. There was no alternative sort of path that he could see for himself.
I guess it was an interesting time, though, because it was a very turbulent time, but it was also a time of great possibility.
Yeah.
I think there was a lot of hope coming out of the mid-'60s, a lot of social turmoil as well with the Vietnam War and what was happening in the US and civil unrest and racial unrest. I also think it was a time of great possibility. So there might not have been a plan B, but I think bands like that took the plunge because they felt liberated. Are we going to talk about, in this first episode, are we going to talk about the formation of Jethro Tull?
Yeah, I think we should actually, because it kind of goes with the debut album, doesn't it?
I think
it would be a bit strange not to. I agree, Brent. I think
and
that's
the dynamics and what happened afterwards, and
and
how
Yoko Ono came in and the band. Oh, hold on, no, wrong podcast. Sorry.
Well, I can give you a bit of background because I have this very simple flowchart that only takes up like 10 pages that came with the 20th anniversary box set. Ian Anderson was in the Blades back in 63, 65.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, and then the Blades,
Cutting edge.
There's lots of other familiar names from there, but he then went into the John Evan Band with most of these same people as well and a few others, who then became the John Evans Smash, who then so then Glenn Cornick was in the John Evans Smash, and him and Ian formed Jethro Tull. And joining them from just over the street in McGregor's Engine, live from in the year of 1967, was Mick Abrams and Clive Bunker. So that's how the four of them got together. So the one through the Blaze and the John Evans Band / Smash, and the other McGregor's Engine.
I think what did happen is that they were John Evans and Jeffrey Hammond. And Barry Barlow, Hammond. Oh, I think he was only a Hammond then, twice, he was a minor. And Barry Barlow were all school friends in Blackpool, and that's where the John Evans band started. And they were a 7-piece playing soul covers and things. And they were booked by Chris Wright, who became a Chrysalis founder, to come and do some gigs in London. And he rang the venues afterwards to find out how they were, and they told them they were a great band for a 4-piece. And John Evans, Barry Barlow, Jeffrey Hammond got homesick and went back to Blackpool, and that's how Jethro Tull
left behind
became a.
So they were like the detritus washed up on the beach. Is that what you're saying at Blackpool?
Well, they all came back. So into the band at times. So I think it was amicable. I think they just didn't
fancy the bright lights of London
for at least the first couple of years. And their guitarist was rubbish. So Chris Wright found Mick Abrams, who was an established blues guitarist, and Clive Bunker was associated with him, and that's how they became Jethro Tull. And I also found out is that who did we think chose the name for Jethro Tull?
Well, Ian Anderson,
of
course.
He denies all knowledge of. He said he had no idea. If he'd known what it meant, he never would have gone with the name. It was some booking agent who suggested the name. Yeah. This is the guy who they wrote a song about. Is that him or no? John G. I don't know. I don't think so. Anyway, that's so I thought.
I find that really surprising. Yeah. I mean, if I was Ian Anderson, I would have owned that.
No, he says he would never have named the band after a dead guy from the 18th century, or a living guy.
You should only ever name your band after live people. Yeah. That's a rule I hold fast to and have my whole life. I'm not going to change now.
But But, whenever I need to name something, I always go and look at 18th century or 17th century agricultural pioneers. It's
fertile
such a rich
ground,
source
one might say.
That's right. I'm sure there's an Ebenezer in there somewhere, and all those sorts of wonderful kind of names of that Jethro. Fantastic! I think it's a great name.
I do too.
Being young and hip and in the moment, it's all right for you old fogies to like it, but as young people, we crave something a bit more modern.
Right.
Have you got a suggestion? If you were the booking agent, Adrian, can you give us an alternative suggestion?
Britney Spears smash, yes, that's.
Well, I think the Mick Abrams smash would have been just fine. I'm just still reeling. I'm sorry to anyone from Blackpool who's listening, but the idea of being so homesick and upset that you go back to Blackpool just seems. Knowing Blackpool as I do, I find that a bit hard to believe.
Well, let's face it, there was no Morecambe.
I have no knowledge of this. So Blackpool is not.
You've never been to
No.
Blackpool? Okay.
No.
We'll have to let's get into it when the Blackpool song comes up in a few
Up the
albums'
pool,
time,
right.
because there's a
You'll-
bit to discuss.
you'll take me
there
up the
about
pool.
the wonders of Blackpool.
Easy. So the other thing is, this isn't the first recording of Jethro Tull that we've heard.
No, I'm still reeling at the quality of the singles that were released prior to this album.
Well, I do think it's kind of appropriate that they were sent out on singles that were mislabeled Jethro Tull, because they really don't have a place in the pantheon, the somethingian of the Jethro Tull songs. They're just so different.
They are.
I find it hard to
I
reconcile.
would prefer to think that they aren't actually Jethro Tull songs. And it's just
they don't,
convenient.
Jethro Tull
Exactly.
songs.
So, do we? We don't want to go into too long a review of them, but obviously they had their minds somewhere else when they were doing those.
So it's Aeroplane and what's the other one? No, My Sunshine. Bring Back My Sunshine Day. Sunshine Day.
Yes. I think the other thing is they were released under a different record label, so I suspect that had
was
something to do with
MGM.
it as well. So they weren't Chrysalis. Yeah.
Derek Lawrence Music.
Yeah.
So he's the one to blame.
Yeah.
Do you think there was some recording company input into?
Yes. I suspect that they were being kind of groomed to be sort of either a sort of West Coast psychedelic rock kind of band or, something like that, and that just didn't work.
It has a kind of almost the Aeroplane in particular. I know both of them have a kind of almost a Monkees sound about them.
Exactly.
I was thinking more Banana Splits, but sure.
That's exactly where I went. I just thought this is manufactured West Coast, pop rock, psychedelic, slightly psychedelic type of thing. Yeah, it's just not Jethro Tull at all.
There is a bit of a riff on the second one, the Bring Back My Sunshine Day, but it's pretty much smothered in blah.
Oh, the lyrics are just so god awful. They are fucking awful. I'm sorry to say that, but they are so bad. I mean, they are just so cliched.
Rating, that went long ago. So no, and I'm sure that Ian Anderson would admit. Have they ever been played live since Jethro Tull? I would be very surprised.
No.
So do we have a one-word, before we move on, do we have a one-word review for that double-sided Jethro Tull single?
Jethro Tull's no Jethro Tull.
Toe Jam.
Oh, okay. I was just going to say pap, but okay.
Yeah.
I like Toe Jam. Toe Jam is good. So.
Stinks. It stinks, and you instantly forget about it once you... It's interesting, you were talking before, Brent, about this sort of cultural
I think zeitgeist is the word
this
you're
cultural
looking for.
shift, being in the sunny northern beaches the sunny northern beaches of Sydney compared to Britain. But there was also this sort of this sort of time displacement culturally as well, because here we are in the mid 1980s listening to these albums that were created in the sort of mid, from sort of late 60s onwards into the 70s, and we were teenagers in the mid 80s. So there was also this cultural shift in that sense, which makes it even sort of, again, surprising that we connected with something that was, a lot of those albums were made at a different time when we were, very small children. But we still managed to connect with the music despite that sort of different country and different time,
I think
culturally.
Good music transcends time. So there's a quality and energy. Not all of it. I'm going to say up front, I'm not a fan of all Tull music, but
and when we discuss particular songs and albums,
yes, but there's certainly a quality and an energy and a vitality and a creativity. It doesn't matter what musical genre it's in, it will out if you open your ears.
I wonder how much of the eventual success was because of how much is the music setting it apart, and how much was it the live performance persona of Ian Anderson kind of cavorting around the front of the stage? Because that would certainly be pretty arresting.
Cavorting.
Yeah, and it certainly would set them apart. And there's something to be said just for pure performance. That's a lot more entertaining than just watching like the Beatles stand there and strum the guitars, right? Shake their heads a bit.
I do think there was a very serious ambition and musicality and attention to detail. So they famously say, and I actually believe them, that you just assume that any band that looked like Tull and were, coming out of the 60s and 70s were drinking and taking drugs. And I believe, and he says that they were dry. And I think, I actually do believe it's true, and I think that is just a reflection of his professionalism and his drive, and I think that shows through in the quality of the music. And a lot of good music did come out of acid trips, and there was some great music that came out of the 60s and 70s. I don't know how it was produced when people were, just stoned or on alcohol in excessive amounts. But I think that just speaks to Ian Anderson is Tull.
Yeah.
I know there have been other very key members of the band.
It's the Ian Anderson
driving
band.
Influence. Every album, they're creative. I do, and he would admit, I'm sure, that, there were very important people. I mean, Martin Barr was there from very early on. We'll get to this. I feel that Tull probably didn't really start until Martin Barr came along, although that was probably coincided with Ian Anderson taking the reins and pushing forward and putting his own vision into the band.
And basically, he hired the car and he was driving it, but didn't mean there weren't passengers and people navigating. And, there are other people, obviously, putting forward their ideas and, making the group what it was. But, it feels like it was, without his drive, his energy, his vision, his willingness to pick up the flute and learn to play it in like a month so that he could play it on. I mean, it's just, he was obviously freakishly talented, as well as, just having this incredible drive.
And even the flute itself, I mean, that's, that I don't think anybody, I mean, outside of jazz, I can't think of anybody who uses a flute.
The only other band I can remember is the Mamas and the Papas.
Right. Did they play the flute?
I think that's a bit of a different kettle of fish. So.
Did someone in the Mamas and Papas play the flute? Did they? Wow.
Well, I don't know if someone did, but again, it was a very sort of airy flute. It wasn't that. It wasn't used as a weapon. Again, Anderson would use it. He really played it like you'd play a harmonica.
It only leaves us to speculate how things might have been if Ian Anderson had picked up the cello or something instead.
Yes. I'm sure he would have rocked it.
Because he plays the flute. Apparently, instead of playing the flute, they wanted to stand up the back and play the piano while Mick Abrams was the front man. So he could obviously play piano as well. He plays the guitars as well, the bass and the lead guitar, or lead guitar, who knows how it's pronounced. I mean, Jesus, why can't they give the real name? So, yeah, he's pretty talented, and he writes the odd song or two. You know, he's got a few strings to his bow.
So it's really interesting, and we'll get into this in many albums, I'm sure. But when I first listened to Tull, I assumed he was just a vocalist and a flautist. But all of that acoustic guitar is Ian Anderson. And if anything, as a very amateur beginner guitarist, I very much appreciate the quality of his acoustic guitar. And one of my favourite Tull moments, and we'll probably talk about the only time we've seen them live, was when I saw them was him playing Life's a Long Song. And he was a very, very talented acoustic guitarist. And for me, that's actually, I mean, he's well known for playing the flute, but probably the thing I appreciate most about him as a musician is his guitar work, acoustic guitar.
Even though he's the lead singer of the band and obviously the front man and does all the singing, as I said before, he's no Freddie Mercury, and his singing is not that remarkable. Yeah, he's obviously a good singer. I'd love to be able to sing as well as he can, but, you know, there's much, much better singers out there. But as the whole package of the musicianship, he's probably less high up on the singing scales than he is on all these other sort of axes, if you like.
Yeah, I guess we've discussed this recently, haven't we? But I've, I guess from the sort of musical direction I've come from my taste, quality of singing is not as important as
the emotion and whatever.
Exactly.
There's also a rare talent that Ian Anderson has that is remarked on is his ability to copy Mark Knopfler's style of vocalization.
So yes, I've heard that was actually because he damaged his voice.
Yes, he ripped it up. Yeah.
But it immediately, we know what album we're talking about. The Heavy Metal Hall of Fame album.
Yeah, I would love an Ian Anderson Dire Straits tribute album. I think it'd be mighty fine.
There is one. I think it won a Grammy Award, didn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
But I don't want to say this. I don't want to be mean. The most boring gig I've ever been to see was a Dire Straits one.
Right.
It was like watching an MTV video. Yeah. Probably didn't help that I was up the back of the Sydney Entertainment Centre. But it was just too perfect.
That's what annoys me about shows these days. You go and see it, the band's on the stage, it's all mic'd up, it comes through the speakers, you may as well be at bloody home listening to a recording of the bloody thing. Which, to me, is a legitimate problem, which is why having someone who is actually performing is really great.
Yeah, and they were superb live performers. Actually, just before I forget, I was going to say that we were talking about the other band members, and if I don't want to focus entirely on Ian Anderson, it's difficult not to, but I guess his other talent was finding talent. So he found the people who he could work with and who could follow his musical vision, and that's also a talent as a leader as well.
Yeah, again, I mean, it's easy enough to say, they went through so many members in 50 years, but they lasted 50 years with some people still there, and you say it takes a certain person, a certain sort of leader to recognise the sort of people that you can bring on board and that will live with your management style, I suppose.
Yeah,
and there was obviously a not a crisis point, but a moment of reckoning at the end of the first album.
And I would say that's a sort of a slight contradiction in the sense that like we've talked about the diversity and breadth of the music, but interestingly, in terms of the band lineup, we're talking about men, right? We're talking about men and English. So it's a very narrow kind of base to source the musicians from.
Apart from the sort of white English middle-aged men who were in the band, there was also No, I've got nothing.
And I don't. I mean, Rush was a little bit like this as well. You know, they made jokes about, there were three women in the audience. You know, that kind of thing. So
that's a product of that. That is very much a product
Yes.
of 70s
yeah.
rock, isn't it?
Well, just the 70s, I think. You have me at 70s.
That's maybe that's another issue. I'm fond of Toll's music, but they were very much a 70s band in the 70s, and that came with some baggage. So some of it a bit seedy.
Yeah.
There's a lot of not just some of the content of the music, but the I don't know, something a bit Benny Hill and Kenny Everett about the stage presence and
the flute shenanigans. Is that where we're going with this?
Yeah. Yeah.
The cod piece, I don't know, but it's a very 70s blokey thing, and they were part of that.
Phallic. Phallic.
The decade of the phallus.
Lots of hair and that's right. That's right.
And it was all a bit seedy and leery, and and punk was a reaction to some of that.
Yes,
I mean, Toll were very firmly in the crosshairs of the punk, as well as bands like Pink Floyd. And I know Ian Anderson, or at least one of his albums, was a direct rebellion against that, pushback against that. But it was a very chauvinistic. And I'm not calling the members of Toll chauvinists. I'm just saying that whole. There's a feeling about the 70s and the early 70s, which is very...
Well, it's like if you were in England and you were putting together a football team, you'd have the same sorts of people. There'd be your mates from down the pub and whatever, and, there'd be no question about who would be in it. Sort of the people from your tribe sort of thing, and women, they had a different role back then, I guess. And being in pub bands was not really it. And it wasn't until, I guess really the 80s again that, when we were seeing bands that you started to see, women performing in these bands, like the Clouds, for example. They were, big.
Yeah, Do Re Mi, two great
Bananarama.
Too, very. No. You lost me there, but
yeah, and with and with Jethro Tull, there's a little bit of Blur, because Blur were middle class boys from arty middle class boys who pretended to be working class, and there was a little bit of that just going back that sort of 70. Even people like sort of Rush again, middle class boys in Canada, but pretending to be working class men. So there was a bit of that kind of working class cock rock kind of machismo that I think Jethro Tull did move on from to a greater degree in their later phases. But you're right, that was very much a product of the 1970s, that kind of working class masculinity. AC/DC. It wasn't just Jethro Tull. There was there's a whole lot of bands.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's like
City Rollers,
just the expected thing of the time.
Exactly. Yeah, but you could have imagined though that and again, I don't want to cast too much criticism on Ian Anderson, amazing individual, but you could imagine in later years he could have perhaps cast the net a bit wider, perhaps. If he had so much say over the sort of band members, but it still maintained a rather, diversity. Despite the diversity of the musical output, the diversity of the members themselves tended to be fairly narrow, I think.
But, you must be doing something right as like these bands like Rush and Jethro Tull when, one of the greatest bands of all time models itself on you. And, of course, I'm talking about Spinal Tap.
Druids.
Of Stonehenge.
Yeah, I was thinking about Spinal Tap. No, not sexist. Sexy.
and I'm sure there's a lot of other bands in there, but when you know the bands like Rush and Jethro Tull pretty well, the minute you see any Spinal Tap stuff, you can just see the elements they've sort of cribbed and drawn from those particular bands, and I'm sure there's others they drew from as well. But again, it's just like a summing up and a poking fun at exactly what we've been talking about, basically, the situation these bands found themselves in and how they lived their lives.
So what's the plan for this years-long podcasting experiment
we're going to tackle an album every month, essentially, aren't we? We're going to tackle an album. Literally talk about the context, how around when the album was produced, but from the band, and also just a general cultural perspective of what's going on at that time, and then talk through song by song. And I think for me, one of the most interesting thing is that some albums are more cohesive than others. Some albums have a through line, a theme, and I think they do that fairly well, and other albums perhaps less so. So I think that's a reasonable way to think about the album in totality. I mean, these days albums are less important than they used to be, but albums used to be something. They were they had a reason for being. They had a reason that that group of songs were put together.
Well, like I said on my Walkman, I'd chuck an album in to my cassette when I got on the bus, and I'd listen to the whole album before I got to uni. Yeah. Whereas kids these days, they just chuck on shuffle on one of their playlists, and you never hear an album. Well, I guess if you really go out of your way, I suppose you can. Yeah. But it's not like back when we were kids, and you would actually sit down and just listen to a whole album. Yeah.
I guess we'll discuss history, but there's a lot of it out there, and a lot of it will be just our own personal engagement with those albums and our favourites and our least favourites. Please don't send hate mail. It's just opinion, and a lot of it has to do with who you were and where you were when you first heard these things. And I've got a lot of associations with Tull albums and particular songs that are reminiscent of very particular times in my life, which is one of the reasons that Tull's been with me ever since I was young, and is still very much part of my life. And I think we'll be discussing the personal aspects.
Absolutely, that's one thing. One thing that
mean to us.
We'll find interesting is, since we all kind of, I guess, started off at the same point almost, with getting into Tull and hearing the same albums at the same time, and being, having reasonably similar lives back then, with kids growing up and going to school and uni and those kind of things. But just how our tastes have changed, and do we still all agree on different albums and songs, and which ones suck and which ones I like and are good.
And some might suck.
So some definitely do suck.
I'm sorry, some are terrible. That's the other thing, though. If you don't, you're talking about diversity. Sometimes, if a band is going to progress, and if they are going to create interesting and new and novel music, sometimes they've got to push boundaries.
They took some risks.
Push on, and sometimes that results in embarrassment.
Passion play.
Sometimes not yet.
Cut that from the podcast.
I'm going to give that one a good try before we. I'm going to try to find the hidden majesty of that album before we get there. But it also results in brilliance, and it resulted in brilliance more often than it did in Drek.
So thank you very much for listening. If you would like to leave us any comments, or you would like to subscribe to this podcast, and we sincerely hope you do, there's a number of ways you can do that. You can find this podcast at www.threethickbricks.com. You can also hit us up on the Facebook page, which is at Three Thick Bricks Podcast. And you can also send us a Gmail if you really want to at threethickbricks@gmail.com. And all of those details will, of course, be in the show notes. So next time, we will be having a look at the debut album of Jethro Tull, which is, of course, This Was, from 1968. And we're all very much looking forward to kicking things off and looking at that album and having a chat about that. So until next time, I'm your co-host Robin, and on behalf of Brent and Adrian, we wish you all the very best, and we will hear from you soon. Thank you.